Okay, so I was just saying, I've graded your intro sections. Sorry it took me so long. Thank you for the patience. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I understand it was some time ago. It's probably, if you've worked on it at all, there's probably a lot of improvement. If not, it's been a while since you've looked at it. But for everybody, including anybody that watches this later, good luck to you on senior design. But today we're going to kind of go through that, go through technical writing tips, some big picture assessments of what I saw going wrong, what I saw going right. And actually a lot of these are pretty typical. Anytime I dig into technical writing for anybody, this is the type of stuff we run into. Thursday we're canceling class. I've got something else to attend to, and I think it just makes sense given that everybody's gone. Okay, so today that's the plan today. Thursday's canceled. Okay, so as we come in to talk about technical writing, first I want to say we had, of course, the requirements here. What you'll find on each of the assignments, hopefully you submit it as a Word document. If not, please do so next time, because I'll copy and paste this section to the bottom of your place. If you submitted a PDF, I just kind of put in a comment somewhere that lists 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 associating with these scores here. So what I've done is I've provided you an intro grade. It probably looks ugly. And this is just simply an assessment of like, hey, if you kept going with exactly what you're doing for this paper, this is probably what you could expect for a grade. Now, some people haven't put in citations yet. Some people found a few references, took notes, didn't cite those references. Some people didn't even get that far. The good thing for everybody is that this is very preliminary. This is not, at the very most, your grade here is going into just a few percentage points of your final paper, but very much more likely I'm just going to take some combination of your draft effort and your final effort, mostly your final effort. So the point here is just to say, hey, if you kept going this way, here's where you're going to end up. And so some of you will be like, yeah, I didn't put in a lot of effort. It was, I could only spare half an hour and I wrote something up real quick and I know I should do better, can do better, blah, blah, blah. Some people put in a great effort and there's some issues that I'm pointing to. So I'm just being as critical as I can to point you in a good direction. Okay, so which is partly why it took me so long, is because I was really commenting anywhere I saw some sort of issue that could lead to improvement. So largely what we'll talk about today. So don't panic if you get a really low score here. That's the deal. Okay, it's in some sense by design. I think nobody did better than close to an 80, right? Even with good effort, quality beginning work there. Okay, so let's get into it. First thing is, I think everybody plagiarized. Now, I say that to elaborate and remind us all what is plagiarism. It's not an intentional thing necessarily. It could be intentional. It could be you intentionally go to ChatGPT to try to do your assignment for you or whatever, or copy paste from some source. But it's actually just simply the lack of appropriate citing or acknowledgement of somebody else's ideas, information, work, something like that. So if I were to write that Nicaragua has 80% unimproved sanitation rates, and let's say I just had heard that from somewhere and I don't cite it, I'm plagiarizing. Because either I'm lying, I just don't have the information, or I found that on the internet or something and I didn't cite it, and I'm taking it for granted. The deal is, for a technical report, the interpretation is that if I'm not citing somebody else, then that's my work. Okay, so as you're writing, keep in mind that the correct impression when you write a statement is that either you did it, if there's no attribution, or you attribute it because somebody else did that work or came up with that idea, right? So it's not just when you like write a quote and forget to add who said the quote. Of course, that's pretty obvious. But anytime we are making a claim like that, that is technically plagiarism if we don't put that. Okay, so I'm going to submit plagiarism violations for everybody. No, not at all. This is the practice here is to build this up to recognize, okay, what's going on? What does this mean? The official policy you can see here, and I just highlighted this lack of appropriate citation or the unacknowledged inclusion of someone else's words, structure, ideas, or data, failure to identify a source, and it continues. Okay, it also, are you in trouble? No, not at this stage, for sure. But strictly speaking, plagiarism is not a question of intent, right? That's why I'm saying everybody probably did so. I think on every paper I was like, where's your references on this one? I'd just write like, if you see my comment, just refs. I'm like, what's the reference for this data or this claim? So it could even be a style potentially if you're, if what we were doing was a more stylistic type of thing without attributing it, some sort of intellectual contribution from somebody else that's not cited, not attributed to them. Now, there is a difference, and I don't think I've got a slide on it. Yeah, between when we make a statement of fact, and goes specifically to the technical writing aspect of things. If we're making a claim of fact, that's going to be a bit different than making an opinion based on the facts we've now reviewed. Okay, so that's the distinction, and that's the place where we find we will make our own intellectual contribution, and then we should not be citing anybody, right? Because that's us. So if you have looked at 5 papers and came to some conclusion that, this technology looks the most promising, that's your idea. So that's your written, like you have now formulated that. Maybe you will say, given that people have studied this X, Y, Z, it is most likely, and then so you would cite right there, and then whatever you say next is your opinion, right? Therefore, the septic system A looks the best or something. That's your own analysis. You've done that. That's your contribution. So that's what we want to try to differentiate between. Now, I've got a few examples in here throughout these slides, and I'm just picking on previous students, sort of. Of course, it's all anonymous, and I think these were 2018 students, so it's been a while. Hopefully nobody knows anybody. It's all anonymized anyway. So previous projects, writing assignments, and you'll see, just like you'll probably see in my feedback to you, you'll see little comment areas where this little section is highlighted, and then it's going to have a comment box out to the right with me saying something about it, right? So you'll see that a lot in your feedback. By the way, when I've entered the grades, there's also a place where I can put in a file for feedback. I basically just taken your document, I added the little rubric with the thing, any comments I've added to your document, and just put it right back there, okay, in Moodle. So that's where you can find the feedback I'm giving you is in Moodle under your assignment. Okay, so let me know if you have any trouble with that. Nobody's ever had an issue, so hopefully that's straightforward for you. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple things here. So for statements of fact, or making a claim of fact, we can look at this excerpt. We have somebody writing, however, the lack of management for industrial, agricultural, and sewage waste that comes with such growth has become a prominent area of concern for both human and ecological safety in this region. Okay, notice there's no claim there. Now, unless this person has studied this, him or herself, gone to that region and talked with people in that region to understand there's concern, or gathered data in some way or another in that matter, specifically relating to the growth causing concern for human and ecological health security. Unless that person has done all of that or has provided that contribution themselves, this here is plagiarism because they need references, right? Now, occasionally, you might have two sentences that are very similar in what their claim is, and you sort of just, the claim is made across two sentences, and then you cite it at the end of the two sentences. That would actually be okay, because it's like kind of a bulk citation. If you're concerned, it doesn't hurt to cite it twice. So you could just repeat the citation. So there are maybe some caveats, but you could just look forward a little bit and see, okay, there's nobody that, there's no citation here. What's the deal? Okay, so that's an example of, we need a citation there. You can see they're making a claim of fact, even though it doesn't feel too much like, the world has 8 billion people in it, right? That's a very concrete fact. This one here is just simply that their claim is the lack of management that comes, that comes with such growth has become a concern for this stuff. Has become a concern in this region, right? That's like the base fact. It is a claim of fact, so it really needs some sort of reference. Now, it might just be that somebody else has described this in their work. That's where you learned it. That's where you learned it's become a concern. So cite where you learned it, right? Ideally, if they cited somebody else who learned it, you should actually cite that original source. Or possibly both if let's say, one paper adds an ecological health security aspect, but there were already the other aspects that were concerned, maybe you cite them both. That kind of, it gets a little bit like a rabbit trail following one citation to the next, but that is an important part of research, and it will help build your own research to be a much higher level if you go and do that to find that original source. And that's what you're supposed to do in terms of avoiding plagiarism, right? You want proper attribution for the source of that information. Okay, so a second example here where I think we've got citations in place. So access to clean and safe drinking water is a critical challenge for people around the world, especially those who live in rural areas. We've got a couple citations there. Photocatalytic technologies may become a solution. So there's a typo here. So we would say may become a sustainable solution, perhaps. To water treatment and solutions repeated. So we've got some issues with that part, but the citations themselves I think are okay, right? So could become a sustainable solution to water treatment in some situations if certain hurdles are overcome. All right, so that feels to me like it's could be partially an opinion, because it's, this could become that, but the person is citing a couple sources here that are probably pertained to certain hurdles needing to be overcome. So perhaps if you were to review this literature, you might come to a conclusion like that. It's not a huge claim of fact. It's not very specific. Maybe you could do that without any citations, but in this case, they found that somebody else had already kind of made a comment that it's likely that this could become the right thing if these hurdles are overcome. So that's fine. But the real key is just simply to distinguish between when you're making that claim from somebody else's work versus you have put this together and synthesized it. And this is actually the whole point of the assignment in general. We'll say this: the purpose of the assignment is expressly to build your own opinion or argument, to make your own statement based off of what you learn from other people, right? So we'll say build or maybe even learn. Your own opinion we'll say build your own opinion based on what you learn from other people. So it's something of an argumentative essay, kind of a deal, where your task is to make an argument, to make a claim, and to support that claim, right? That's what we've done since, I don't know, middle school English or whatever, right? You're building some sort of an essay, even just a paragraph, whatever. You're going to try to make your case, and then you need to support it, right? And so there's this process of the support is coming from somebody else and you attribute it to them, but then you're making your own opinion and giving it to me, trying to convince me of something, or your audience. Maybe you were to share this with somebody else or publish it or something. That's your opinion building from this other stuff. So that's the distinction. Work towards being able to make the claims on your own knowledge and distinguish that, and like that's what your paper should do, is build up the situation where you can then make that claim. Looked at these things, X, Y, Z, systems A, B, and C with these factors. Therefore, this one seems to be the best, or seems to be the most likely, the most problematic, whatever your claim is. Okay, so when do you not need to cite? Sometimes, and I kind of mentioned this already, if you are leading into a sentence with a statement that's going to be cited. So here's an example. Several recent studies aimed to better understand the inhibitory mechanism of dissolved organic matter in photocatalytic systems. So we could put a citation there, but it's kind of vague. It's just saying several studies have done this. And the very next sentence, the very beginning of the next sentence, we're already talking about a study, right? In 2015, Brame et al. Experimentally validated, blah, blah, blah. And then there's going to be, at the end of this sentence, 1 to 2 and 13, I don't know, whatever citations are appropriate there. So that will include the citations, and it kind of makes sense that those two sentences together are kind of one claim. It doesn't hurt to put the citations right here, but it's not mandatory in that case. If I'm looking at your work and you've done exactly this, I should not count off for you for having put it at the end of the next sentence. But if I'm not paying close enough attention, there's a chance I would question that at first when reviewing. I think hopefully I'll pay enough attention for that. But people might be like, oh, you need a reference here. But usually what will happen is I'll mark it, I'll make a comment, and then I'll realize a moment later, oh, when I finish reading, there we go, it's fine. Okay, so another example here. A further cause of concern that supports the importance of preventing landfill leachate is the water shortage issue that I forgot how to pronounce that. Oyaka, probably, and other cities in Mexico are facing geographically. So they're going to continue on. So water shortages is something they're talking about, and as long as they're continuing with the water shortage conversation in some way to make that claim, then I would say it's probably fine to add their citations here, right? So you kind of get the picture there, but if you're in doubt, just go ahead and cite it. Right? I do that myself sometimes, like, well, it's kind of following this, but it's sort of
almost two claims here, or it might get confusing, or this was a really long sentence, let's just go ahead and cite it both times. And especially if you're using kind of a simplified format, it's not taking up a lot of space. So no harm there. Okay, next topic is an issue that everybody deals with, including myself. But I'm going to be quite persistent with you all on your writing, because it is a topic that can really transform the readability and the effect of your writing. That also means that it's going to transform your thinking. That sounds a little weird, but in order to write, that is, in some sense, a process of thinking. So by forcing you, or by tasking you to write with this so-called active voice, it's going to force you to really think about who's doing the action on what, and what kind of specific, direct, clear implications are there for that. So I'm going to get into some examples, but the whole purpose, and sometimes passive, so it's active voice and passive voice. Sometimes passive voice is fine and appropriate and better. But in general, in technical writing, when we can use active voice, we should be using active voice. It's going to make everything easier to read, which is the number one goal for technical writing. We're dealing with technical stuff that's really hard to comprehend if we're doing technical stuff, right? It's going to be heavy. It's going to be all sorts of jargon. We have to get it clear and easy to read. That's top priority. And it's going to cause you to be more specific, more careful with how you're saying things. Okay, so I'm going to read off the slide a little bit, and I've got a video that will help explain it further with the next slide. So the reason to use a passive voice is if you want to de-emphasize the thing or person doing the action. So let's give an example. Active voice would be Sam caught the pen. A passive voice would be the pen was caught by Sam. Means the same thing. But we were kind of reoriented the sentence there, and it changes the dynamic of what you're communicating. Okay, so the active voice means the sentence has the subject that acts upon the verb. So Sam catches, or throws the pen, right? I am acting on the verb. That I'm the one taking that action. Passive voice means that the subject is the recipient of the verb's action. So now, instead of me being the subject, it's the pen. So the pen was thrown. I'm out of the picture. Doesn't have to be me. It could have been Eben. Could have been, somebody often doing their senior design. They're just frustrated and throws the pen, right? Whoever it might be. It doesn't matter anymore who did it. It's the pen is the subject, and it was thrown. Sometimes that's important when we're describing, for example, certain aspects of experiments, and we don't want to use first-person stuff in technical writing, so we don't say that I performed this experiment. That would be active. Instead, we might revert to passive to say this experiment was performed. Sometimes that's appropriate, but if you can give that your attention and say, well, let's try to make that active, you might actually find you're getting very much more clear and specific. So if I'm talking about like a pen throwing experiment, maybe we say participants threw the pens to test this hypothesis. Or to test this hypothesis, participants threw pens. Now, we are still active voice, but we've included a little more detail, and it's pretty simple, right? Instead of saying the experiment was performed by participants throwing pens,
the whole sentence gets a little muddier. Now, a lot of times when we're talking, we do passive voice a fair bit, and we're not thinking too much about it. And that sounds natural. So when we're writing, we really want to think about making sure that's active whenever possible. Okay, so this goes on to say, and this I think is from the Grammarly page on it, you may have learned that passive voice is weak and incorrect. It's not quite that simple. It should be, there are cases where it's correct, I mentioned, and in moderation. But if we're doing every sentence in passive voice, there's clearly an issue, especially in technical writing. Okay, so their examples here: monkeys adore bananas, whereas you could say bananas, so that would be active, whereas you could say bananas are adored by monkeys. You could even go so far as saying bananas are adored, right? Maybe I adore bananas. Who knows, right? Somebody's adoring bananas. The subject is now the banana, and it's being adored. So that's the difference. Another example, the cashier counted the money versus, that's active. And you see it's counted, right? There's no being counted. No to be or was being, anything like that. You'll notice it's like, typically if it's past tense, it's just a past tense verb. Or if it's active, it's just counts, just caught, jumped. It's the direct. Whereas on the passive voice, the money was counted by the cashier. And what you'll notice here is when we're doing technical writing, that cashier might have been a very important component of our conversation, but now by structure, we've de-emphasized it and made it confusing for the reader to even get to know who's doing this action until the very end of the sentence. So that loses your focus. It causes the reader to lose focus because they needed to know that it was the rat that ran through the puzzle in the experiment, perhaps. Okay, so the dog chased by the squirrel versus the squirrel was chased by the dog. All right, so this goes on to say a bit about the passive voice. The subject acted on by the verb. It's always constructed with a conjugated form of to be plus the verb's past participle. So that's was counted, was chased, are adored. Okay. So one thing to practice then is to just notice when you're doing it. I obviously was calling it out many times when I saw it, probably not every single time, but whenever I thought that the sentence was already a little unwieldy, a little difficult to follow, and I notice it, that I definitely make a comment there most times. And you'll see me just write in the comment passive voice. What I'm asking you to do is convert from this style of writing to this. Okay, so we'll come back to this in just a second. I'm going to go ahead and play this video for you. Kind of summarizes and hopefully a little bit more clearly that stuff that I just said. Let me make sure I've got sound working properly here. Okay, there we go. All right.
Some people think passive voice is a bad word. But is that really true? I'll dive right into the topic and get to the bottom of this in this episode of Grammarly's Level 1. If you find this video helpful, please be so kind as to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. And before you go, make sure you visit Grammarly.com to see how you can download free communication assistance today. Let's move on to the lesson. It's important to note that the active voice makes your writing stronger, more direct, and you guessed it, more active. But on the other hand, with the passive voice, the subject is acted upon by some other performer of the verb. But truth be told, the passive voice is actually not incorrect. In fact, there are times when it can come in handy. So, what is the difference between active and passive voice? While tense is all about time references, voice describes whether the grammatical subject of a clause performs or receives the action of the verb. Here's the formula for the active voice. Subject plus verb performed by the subject plus optional object. For example, Chelsea kicked the ball. In a passive voice construction, the grammatical subject of the clause receives the action of the verb. So the ball from the above sentence, which is the receiving action, becomes the subject. The formula for the passive voice: subject plus some form of the verb to be and a past participle of the transitive verb plus optional prepositional phrase. The ball was kicked by Chelsea. That last little bit, by Chelsea, is a prepositional phrase that tells you who the performer of the action is. But even though Chelsea is the one doing the kicking, she's no longer the grammatical subject. A passive voice construction can even drop her from the sentence entirely. The ball was kicked. If you're writing anything with a definitive subject that is performing an action, you'll be better off using the active voice. And if you search your document for occurrences of was, is, or were, and your page lights up with instances of a passive voice, it may be a good idea to switch to active voice. That said, there are times when the passive voice does a better job of presenting an idea, especially when the performer of the action of a sentence's verb is very general or diffuse, is unknown, or should get less emphasis than the recipient of the action. Here are 3 common uses of the passive voice. Use number 1, in broad statements about widely held opinions or social norms. Example, tipping less than 20% is now considered rude. The writer of this sentence is communicating that they believe enough people share the opinion that tipping less than 20% is rude to qualify as a consensus. In other words, the performer of the action, the people doing the consider, is so general that it can be left out of the sentence entirely. Use number 2, in reports of crimes with unknown perpetrators or other actions with unknown doers. Example, my car was stolen yesterday. If you knew who stole the car, you might be closer to getting it back. The passive voice here emphasizes the stolen item and the action of theft. Here's another example. The grass was cut yesterday. The emphasis here is on the grass, which presumably is observably shorter. Someone must have cut it, but whoever it was is not the concern of the sentence. Use number 3, in scientific context. Example, the mouse was placed in a T-shaped maze. Well, who placed the mouse in the maze? Scientists, perhaps, but that's less important than the experiment they're conducting. Therefore, passive voice. Let's now look at scenarios where you want to keep the focus on an action and/or the recipient of the action. In each of the sentences I'm about to read, the passive voice is natural and clear for one of the reasons I previously shared. Passive. Bob Dylan was injured in a motorcycle accident. Active. A motorcycle accident injured Bob Dylan. Passive. Elvis is rumored to be alive. Active. People rumor Elvis to be alive. Passive. Don't be fooled. Active. Don't allow anything to fool you. To sum up the passive versus active voice discussion, remember these 5 points. 1. The passive voice isn't a grammatical mistake. It's a matter of style. 2. Use the active voice if it makes your sentence sound clearer and more natural. 3. Forming passive voice requires the verb to be and a past participle. 4. The passive voice is your friend when the thing receiving an action or the action itself is the important part of the sentence. 5. When it comes to good writing, don't be passive, even if your sentences sometimes need to be. That's all for this active episode of...
All right, so as you notice there, he says it's not a technical grammatical mistake to use passive voice, but I will say it is a style mistake to use convoluted language in technical writing, right? So if we're using the passive voice all the time, we are convoluting our sentences, making them harder to interpret by nature, by what we just talked about. So I will say for technical writing, it is a mistake to overuse it, or to use it in cases where you are causing the sentence to be more confusing than it needs to be. So I'm going to treat it kind of like a grammar mistake, according to the rubric kind of thing. Okay, so just to summarize, when we do want to use the passive voices, we are intentionally de-emphasizing the doer of the verb. So instead of who threw the pen, the fact that the pen was thrown, kind of thing. So an example for an experiment, and I kind of touched on this. This is just one kind of I sketched out. We might be trying to write about what we did in the lab. And we said, or we might think to say, we performed an experiment with bacteria. We don't want to use the word we because this is technical writing and we're trying to remove any third person pronouns. So we ought to de-emphasize that. So we could simply say an experiment was performed with bacteria. And oftentimes when we're writing methods and materials type of section of a paper, that's totally fine. That's not really very convoluted. That would be acceptable. But maybe we can be more specific and active. If we elaborate a little bit, we might say experiments subjected bacteria to these conditions. So then it's active, and we've included some extra conditions there so that we're sort of emphasizing these experiments now and being specific with what was going on. So there's a room for it, there's an opportunity for it, but this is a case where it's not necessarily so mandatory, right? So work on looking at that when you can make a sentence more clear, or if you feel like you wrote a sentence, you've got the idea out there, but it's convoluted, it just doesn't feel right, check to see if this is something where you can convert from passive voice to active voice. I'll say it's not always an easy task. And that's why I'm saying this applies to me as well when I'm writing. This is something that I'm like, okay, what am I really trying to say here? And that's why I'm saying it causes you to think a little more clearly. What are you truly trying to say and how can you say it? Okay. This is just a little bit further of an elaboration. So let's say a student plagiarizes a paper. We'll say, if that's our sentence, for now, the subject would be the student, the verb would be plagiarized, and the paper would be an object, right? Whereas if we instead, we'll use a different color, if we instead wrote that a student was plagiarizing a paper, I'll just write it down. Let's see, is that actually passive voice? I think it is. Sorry, no, let's rewrite this. A paper was plagiarized. So the plagiarizing, that's actually not the correct form. So if we rewrite that a paper was plagiarized by a student, the paper is now the subject. This is still the verb here, but it's this passive verb. And the student kind of is no longer in play as That's not the object. It's no longer the subject. It's just this preposition, this add-on, right? It's kind of optional. Yeah. Pronouns and technical writing, to an extent. Do you have an example you're wanting to know about, or?
So maybe you want to refer to a process.
Yeah.
And maybe you say
This process.
This process.
Okay. Very good question. This is, I think, my next slide, or very soon. We will come exactly to that. The use of this, the use of it, the use of that. We need to be careful to be clear with our writing. And so I will spend a couple minutes talking exactly on that. So I'll answer that momentarily. Okay, I think we've done probably enough with the voice changes. If this is not clear yet, just take a look back as you start writing to the slides or to that video. Maybe we could. Okay, one last example I have here, I think. So considering the subject versus the object. So here's a sentence that says the state's capital city, also named Oyaka, has recently shined a light on the state's garbage disposal issue and has reestablished more environmentally responsible practices. So has recently shined, so has shined and has reestablished. Okay? Both of those having the has there and that past tense. We could write this instead. The city shined a light, right? We could structure it, maybe that's shown a light, I think. City shone a light on the disposal issues and established maybe reestablished. I'm actually, maybe this wasn't actually passive tense, but I just don't know if it needed to be this has shined. I might actually have this one a little wrong, this example. Because the city is still shining a light on the issues and reestablishing practices. So this is probably not actually passive in terms of the technical, but I don't think it needed to be this has shined, right? It could just be past tense. Yeah. So this is probably me mistaking this has shined for passive, and it might have just been bad grammar. Or maybe I just don't know enough grammar to say what exactly it is. Maybe it's correct, but could be a little more clear.
It's like that. It's saying it has to shine, but I don't understand that's different from just shine.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So that's. I agree with that. I think this is not quite the the passive voice here, but still maybe could be clear. Okay, pronouns. Speaking of, good question there. The most important thing I find with pronoun usage is to avoid letting the antecedent, which is the fancy word for meaning the thing the pronoun refers to that came before. Ante is kind of the Latin term for saying before, like antebellum is before war, whatever, so it's like instead of post, it's ante. It's, for if you're doing any like playing poker or something, you ante, right? It's the thing that comes before anything else. And so the antecedent, it's the thing that the noun that the pronoun is going to refer to, right? So we just want to make sure that's very clear. Again, emphasizing our technical writing has to be as clear as we can get it. Pronouns can help with that, so we're not saying, repeating long, complicated words all the time. That's no fun either. But we have to make sure that it's clear. So, when we're using it, that, this, These are all pronouns that can refer back to something. Those are what I'm going to talk specifically about. When it comes to it, sometimes there's a formality issue there. Conversationally, we talk about, oh, it's the best thing. Or kind of to imply everybody knows, like, it is known. Maybe that's okay sometimes, but there's a lot of times where it's just not appropriate. What I just said there, there's some implication that we know in speaking, in our, the way we speak makes sense. You catch it, it flows. But in written, we try to avoid that informality there when possible. Okay, I have to confess here, this is a particular, not a sore spot, but something that my 10th grade English teacher really basically took a power drill straight into my head with it, right? Because she had us write papers for our class, and every time we made a mistake, and I made plenty, I remember starting a sentence, for example, with this, and I didn't clarify what it refers to is, I don't know, I made some sentence, right? X, Y, I guess X, Y, X this time. This is something. Without defining this or reminding the reader what it's calling back to, she took 2 points off every time, right? And this is a semester paper or something like that. A big paper says 2 points every time you do it, and you have a 4 or 5 page paper or something, I don't know how long. That adds up pretty quick, and your score drops pretty quick. You're making that mistake over and over again. So I learned a long time ago that this mistake is important, right? So when I write on your writing undefined antecedent or undefined, or maybe I'll just be a little less formal and say, what is this? What I'm referring to is that this, or it, what is it? I'm calling it out to say this has not been defined in your sentence here. So sometimes it'll feel redundant, but it's really good to define in the context of the technical writing. In large part because if you go and read a paper, you'll notice you might get distracted. Chances are good it's not the most gripping thing you've ever read. It's not the most flowing conversation you've ever been a part of, right? Chances are pretty good something distracts you and you come back to it. You look away, you come back, and then you've lost your spot, but you were on this sentence, and then you're like, oh, okay, this is because, wait, what is this? what? And then you have to go backwards. And we just really want to avoid as much hindrance as we can for letting people get through the paper, right? So if you just simply say, this technique was developed because, instead of just saying this was developed because, it can help the reader so much, all right? So it's really important for technical writing. It's grammatically an error if to not do it. So let's go through some examples here. All right, so here's a sentence. It has a little issue here. So we'll say the majority of contaminants are organophosphates and organochlorine. The next sentence starts with, these are known to cause. Now, this one is fairly clear because the previous sentence was pretty simple and straightforward. So I totally get it that you don't feel like you need to clarify. And in this case, it would feel a bit redundant. But it is still best practice to go ahead and clarify. So this would also count as or these would also count as one of the pronouns, right? These, those. So in this sentence, we've used contaminants, and then we named them both. We don't want to name both of them, which is why we're using a pronoun. But we could say these compounds. Okay. Now, that would help us distinguish these because it could refer to these two, or it could refer to contaminants, right? So there, even in this simple case, there is some unclarity. It's also possible that it could refer to water sources. Maybe that's what the writer was going for. So we really want to be clear on what it's heading to, and by adding compounds, that directs us specifically to these guys. So rather than questioning where it's going, we add that clarification, and then we know. Okay, known to cause many health effects, blah, 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 and cancer. Okay, and it continues. So that's the situation on pronouns. We want to avoid I, we, for the almost always. Occasionally, just to make something very clear, or if it's very clear that a discussion is described and maybe in conclusions from a group of researchers, maybe they would say, we concluded that, and that's professional enough. But if it's everywhere, if it's frequent, and if it's in places where you're really not dealing with the researcher's actual opinions solely, you probably just don't want to go there, right? So it's better practice to avoid it. You'll see it occasionally, but okay. Does that make sense with the pronouns? Okay. So probably everybody, in addition to passive voice and plagiarizing, probably everybody had this issue too. These are some of the most common errors I see in technical writing.
Institutions where what you are referring to is supposed to be the same thing. So, let me give an example. In septic systems, it's something.
Okay.
Right, is that pronoun or
This is a very good question. So in septic systems, we'll say, you're saying it here, maybe we'll say it is common, and then we'll leave off there and just imagine the rest of the sentence.
because what you need to, because subjects are in the sentence, so we need to put it.
You're saying there's no need to put it there?
Yeah. Would there be a need to put it?
So this is you're both on a very good question here, because that it is not actually a pronoun. That it right here is actually being used like we speak. There's some assumptions or some unspoken things there. So when we say it is common, I think what we're actually referring to is the common practice is. So this is an informal speech pattern, and this thank you for bringing this up, because it's actually not being used as a pronoun, because it's not referring to, it is not referring to septic systems. You're pointing that out. It's like, is it really needed there? We just said it, right? So you are exactly correct to identify that, and you're correct to wonder, like, is this appropriate? What's up with this? It's because this is a case where it's informal, and it's not even a pronoun. It's implied. I just use it in speech, right? It is implied. So if we are to write this more clearly, we would say, in septic systems, the common practice, or the, I'm going to add practice there. It could be some other word. The common understanding, the typical way of doing things. I'll make sure to get these slides posted, and I probably have slacked on getting the other slides posted, but I'll make sure they're all updated soon, so you'll have those there too. And they do have the annotations, unless I don't think I made any mistakes this semester if I accidentally hit delete them or something. But usually they'll all be up there with the writing. But yeah, so great questions there and insights, because I do call that out sometimes, and maybe I'm just saying, what is it? It's not actually undefined. it's this moment where, or maybe I'll say it's too informal. That's the reason, because we could be more clear. Now, we say it in spoken English, so sometimes it would be okay. It just did it, right? Even in technical writing, you see it with some frequency. To me, it feels a little informal, where we could be more specific and clear. So try to avoid it. That time it was a pronoun, it being this issue. Try to avoid it. See if you can avoid doing that. But it's not the worst thing in the world. Okay? If you can bring more clarity and more professionalism, that's the right time to change the practice. Okay. You guys are just like a little ahead of me, because this is kind of the leading directly into idioms, speech patterns, things like that. It, in the way we just described it, is a great example. So again, the theme here, our technical topics are complex, hard to explain. We just don't want to make them any harder, right? So an idiom is a combination of words, or I guess sometimes a single word, that has a figurative meaning. So when we were just writing it is known, or it is common, things like that, probably really means researchers generally understand, or people tend to believe. This is a generalization of some sort, and maybe it's okay. We talked about that one already. We also want to avoid things like contractions, like can't, won't. We would rather just say them a little more specifically. Now, this is not really idioms, but we would say cannot or will not, right? So being clear on that. Let's see. I wonder if I don't know if I have a good example here, but we'll just read this real quick. So what is an idiom? Generally, it's a widely used phrase that when taken as a whole, we have a particular meaning that would not be able to deduce from the meaning of the individual words. Maybe we can come up with some examples together. They give an example that still is like a little hard to grasp in a way. We often say, "How are you doing today?" People generally understand that's kind of a hello, maybe a question. How are you doing? Like, yeah, I want to know how you're feeling, what's going on. But how, if we stop and think about, like, how do we do this? How do we know this? The word how is actually doesn't quite mean the same, like, we're substituting it there, and I never thought about this really. It's still kind of blowing my mind a little. It's not quite the right word for how are you doing, right? How is normally like by what means, or I'll just read this here. Taken literally, doesn't make a lot of sense, because normally how means in what manner. In what manner are you doing today? It's a little off when you think about it that way. To what degree are you doing today? Maybe if we elaborate a little, to what degree are you feeling good or bad today? There you go. But we just put that all in, how are you doing? How's it going? Right? To what extent is it going today? So it's kind of funny. We think that that's just so obvious that it's just normal English, but if we really drill down, that's not quite. So we'll have other idioms, or these things with the idiomatic meaning. Can you guys think of any examples of idioms? We could search for some, try to think of some that I've seen in writing. think here's a good one. A lot. That's kind of informal to use in writing, so I might call you out on that. So if you're saying it increased by a lot, well, technically speaking, a lot, it's like a lot of land, like a parking lot. So in technical writing, unless you're speaking of it increased by 20 lots of land or something of a certain size, that's kind of too informal, right? So that upland. This is the lot itself. We've used it so commonly in spoken English to just mean much. My mind keeps wanting to say to mean lots. It's so ingrained, right? What's that?
I think a lot of readings use other radios.
Yeah.
Like, what's up?
What's up? Yep. What's happening? Anything? Yeah, even so. There's a funny one I learned coming to Louisiana. It's come see. You know that one? Yeah. So in other parts of the U.S., come see would mean basically, hey, I want you to come look at this. But in Louisiana, it's very common to say, come see, but you just want the person to come over. So nothing actually to see, maybe. There might be, but yeah. So So the point being here, when we go to write technically, since everything else is so technical and word for word, we're trying to keep with that so that if you do write a lot of something, the reader can literally think of a lot instead of, a large amount of, right? So especially when we're trying to describe something technical, that can get pretty distracting and jarring almost to be really in the technical and then having to come to some idiom. Another reason for this is to recognize that our technical writing will often have, especially if we're publishing this somewhere, will often have people that are not accustomed to our standard English idioms. English is probably these days the most common language to write technical reports, scientific reports in. It used to be that German was quite popular, and I think for a time French. Right now it's English, so if we are writing to an international audience, it's probably best, our work is more readable, more useful, if we avoid that kind of stuff. Okay, last topic here. Well, I think it's last, maybe almost last. There's one other thing I want to talk about. But as we're constructing sentences, one thing that I also see go wrong sometimes is properly using commas to separate clauses, components of sentences, and the use of participles and participial phrases. So, when you have a phrase that doesn't really matter a lot to a sentence, we would typically call that, I believe, a subordinate clause. So if we take a look at the sentence down here, glazed with barbecue sauce, the rack of ribs lay nestled next to a pile of sweet coleslaw. Now I'm a little hungry. Glazed with barbecue sauce, it's a nice little flavor to the sentence. It's an addition, but it's not necessary in any way. We could simply say the rack of ribs lay nestled next to the coleslaw. So the fact that it doesn't matter means we're going to add that comma. It's a subordinate, doesn't have to be there, so it's just comma. There are a lot of ways to use a participle or a participle phrase. You could even just say something like recently. Recently, comma. That would be a participle that's saying, just giving some reference. It's not mandatory for the sentence. That's going to be the pattern here. Okay, there's an article here to take a closer look if you're interested. Now, the other issue I see sometimes is the use of conjunctive adverbs. And here's a list of them. So, accordingly, however, indeed, hence, moreover, therefore, however, consequently, similarly, still, all of these pieces that we might put at the beginning of a sentence, or perhaps the beginning of a second clause to a sentence. So typically we might have a main clause and then comma a normal conjunction like and, but, maybe because, things like that. And then main clause. That would be typical, but there's another approach we can use, which is a conjunctive adverb. So we'd have a main clause, a semicolon, and you can do this transition without a semicolon, without the conjunctive adverb too. You could have just a semicolon instead of the conjunction, right? That's fine practice as well. So have a main clause, semicolon, main clause. They're related, but they're independent. So if you do this, the proper way to do so is to make some statement, however, to use a semicolon when you do so. So the sentence I just said, right? So to make some statement, that's my first main clause, semicolon, and I'm just going to put this over here, however, and then you need a comma, use a semicolon and comma. Something like that. So, well, this is actually a bad example. I'll say, however, you need to use. Oops. Wait. There we go. You need a semicolon. Okay. The issue there was I wrote a clause that was not a complete, was not an independent clause. There was no verb. So I had to add a verb there. Okay, so we make one part of the sentence. We can do the semicolon, that conjunctive adverb, in this case, however, comma, you need. And this is also good practice if you're going to just simply start a sentence this way. That would be the way to do it. You have this conjunctive adverb, comma, so however, comma, blah, 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 blah. You could even shift it a little bit, maybe, if you really want to. So sometimes you could kind of interrupt the sentence as long as it's still clear. So I'll make an example. Sometimes, however, the construction is so vigorous that it shakes the screen. So you see I added that however with some sort of thing before it. Like, some days, however, the construction shakes the whole building. Kind of crazy. Okay, this is the last one, I believe, that I wanted to give you a tip on. I see this sometimes, and it was every time I came across people writing due to or because of, occasionally it felt wrong to me, and so I had to look this up, and it improved my own writing to come to terms with this. If you're using due to, you might think, oh, I could use because of or due to, and it kind of does the same thing, right? Well, there is a technical difference, and there's a nice little article here. There's a test you can use to determine which one you're doing correctly. I'll explain that in just a second. Technically, the difference between these two phrases, due to is an adjective, so it can modify only pronouns and nouns. And because of is an adverb, so it can't do the same thing as due to, and it can only do verbs, adjectives, or clauses, not nouns and pronouns. So if you don't know what's going on, you're not sure which to use, which probably is most of us, what you can do is check to see if you can replace the phrase with caused by. This is, I've started using a writing to you, check the caused by substitution. The projector shook because of the construction. Should it be due to or because of? Would it make sense to say that the projector shook caused by the construction? No, but if we rephrased it, the projector's shaking was caused by the construction. So if we wrote it, the projector was shaking blank of the construction, we could check because of the construction sounds fine, but if we check and it's caused by works also, we should then use either caused by or due to. All right, so that's the trick. Their example here is my low grade was due to lack of study, and we can substitute and see my low grade was caused by lack of study, and that works. It feels like it works when you say my grade was because of lack of study. Sounds correct, but technically, it's probably incorrect. Okay, a few more examples. I missed the class due to the rain. I missed the class caused by the rain. No, the rain didn't cause the class, right? So that one actually doesn't work. Missed the class because of the rain. Okay, so I'm not a full expert on grammar and everything, but hopefully this is helpful. These are very common mistakes I see and can help you write better, more clearly. So please do let me know if you've got questions on that. Hopefully I've been clear with your the feedback I've given you. I've tried to do that quite thoroughly for you. All right, so we'll see you a week from today. Yeah.